Just want to say I hope you're healthy, staying healthy, sane, and healthy and sane during these times. My name is Paul Sherman. I'm the Senior Programs Manager for SID Washington. So I help to put on all the programming that we do. So first and foremost, I'd like to start off and thank all of our speakers and our moderator today for coming out and speaking with us and our community. We really do appreciate your time. And also like to give a shout out to the co-chairs, Denise Wales and Katie Cheney, who always do a great job in putting our events together for the Gender and Inclusive Development Workgroup. So we really appreciate their support as always. In addition to the ASL interpreters that we have on the call today, we really appreciate your work and helping us out, being here for us today. So I don't want to go into our typical spiel, just wanted to say that, we're an events and membership-based organization in the international development space. So we host a whole bunch of events, and they're here for information sharing and networking. So we hope that you can attend, get a lot out of this event today, and attend and participate in future events too. We don't have too many events in the calendar right now. We have two more. We have one next week and one at the end of the month. But there'll be more. That's our MO, and we'll always keep moving. So you'll see something from us in the future moving forward. So I will not take up any more time. I'm going to hand it off to Denise, Katie, and Jerry, our moderator today, who can kick us off and get the event started.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, welcome. And Katie and I are so pleased to have you with us. It looks like we've got about 50 people on the call. So thank you for joining us. Disabilities inclusion was one of the top 2 topics prioritized by a group of us, about 25 people who attended the Gender and Inclusive Development Workgroup planning meeting in the fall. So we're very glad to be hosting this discussion now, as it's more timely than ever in this unprecedented times and crisis we're facing. I believe this is the 3rd event in SID's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series. And as such, we are pleased to be able to provide American Sign Language interpretation, which has been sponsored by Save the Children and is being delivered by Deaf Access Solutions. And so you see Katie Holter and Karen, they are signing for us. So thank you so much to those organizations. For our structure, it's going to be a facilitated discussion. We'll put the agenda up because we want to be able to have some interaction for you. So we're going to do it in two sessions. We'll have a panel discussion and then break for questions and answers. And as Paul mentioned, you can put your questions in the chat box as we go along. But we will have a break so that we can be sure to get to to those questions and then resume again and then end with another question and answer session. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jerry Mendez. Jerry has been instrumental in helping us put this event together, so Katie and I want to thank him very much for that. Jerry has been an advocate and a policy and program specialist in US-based and international programs for individuals with disabilities throughout his career. I first met Jerry when he joined IFAS to design and manage their global initiative to enfranchise people with disabilities. And so that's been probably longer than we'd want to say, right, Jerry? But he continued to advance and address disabilities inclusion in his role as Managing Director of International Development at American Institutes for Research. And currently he's focused on inclusive education and serves as Washington representative of Leonard Cheshire Disability, that's a UK-based organization with programs in Africa and Asia. So with that, I will hand it over to Jerry and our distinguished panel. So thank you all again.
Sorry, Denise, just want to make a few announcements about the ground rules because I forgot to mention those. So for the ground rules for today, everyone, I forgot to mention at the top of this. if you are, so if you're, as Denise said, if you're joining us via video chat, feel free to drop all of your questions into the chat box. Even during the panel, when the panel's doing their having their discussion, SID staff will be checking the chat constantly and making sure we have all the questions. And then we'll go, and then I'll act as MC and provide and announce them to the speakers. So that's something that will be done. So feel free, don't be shy. Always feel free to be sending something in the chat box. If you're joining via phone, we will have there are three things. A, if you want, there are two commands that just to familiarize yourself with. One's #6 and the other's #9. #6, I believe it's muting yourself then, and additionally, if there's a raise your hand feature, so that will allow you to allow us to see that you would like to speak. So obviously, since you don't have access to the chat box, you can we can go about it that way. So just wanted to bring those couple points up. And then also just want to mention to thank you to Save the Children for helping us get get our ASL interpreter, or great ASL interpreters today. And just to clarify, they're not sponsors for this event, so just wanted to clarify that. And with that, I'll hand it to Jerry.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome, everybody. It is great to see at least about 25 of you on my screen. Thank you for making time on when we are all in successive Zoom meetings all day long and most of the evening. These are challenging times, and our structure will recognize that. We're going to spend about the first half of our discussion talking about disability and international development in a sort of a business as usual context. In the second half of our discussion, we'll pivot to discuss how international development, which is, I think, in crisis mode, maybe the greatest crisis or challenge that international development has ever faced, how will international development's response to COVID-19 be inclusive, not only people with disabilities, but other vulnerable populations. So that will be the structure. We have our panelists come from 4 different types of organizations and looking at and involved in disability inclusion. We have Ruby Holmes of Humanity and Inclusion, an organization that uniquely and for a long time has worked with and for people with disabilities in the developing world, particularly in conflict and crisis and emergency settings. We have Hana Jahan, a disability rights activist from Bangladesh, who has worked with disabled persons organizations and brings that perspective to our discussion. Carolyn Aylesbury of Save the Children represents a large international non-government organization and will talk about how disability is included on that broader agenda. And last but not least, we have our donor representative, Kathy Guernsey, who is USAID's disability rights specialist. And we'll give them each a chance to introduce themselves. I'm going to take a few minutes at the top to give a broad overview of the sort of history of disability and international development, with some emphasis on USAID's history over the last 40 years. And I'm going to try and take about 30 seconds per decade. I want to start with maybe something of controversy. And those are 2 things that have really influenced, in some ways, in a not so positive way, how we've thought about disability in the context of development. And one is the international symbol of disability, which, if you recall, shows a woman or a person in a wheelchair. The second is the oft-cited World Health Organization statistic that 20% of the world's population has a disability. These images and statements have often distorted the delivery of foreign aid, overemphasizing, in my opinion, certain disabilities and not paying close enough attention to the prevalence of disability in the sectors where we work. And just briefly, for example, if you, and I know IFAS is on the call, the International Foundation for Election Systems, if you're working in elections, old people tend to vote a lot, and disability is most prevalent among the elderly, people 65 and older, particularly in this country. And disabilities like mobility and sensory disabilities, and even intellectual disabilities, cognitive function, increase dramatically as the population ages. Whereas if you look at an education profile or program, the prevalence of disability is going to be a lot smaller. Sensory and mobility disabilities are at the bottom of the prevalence pool, with cognitive and developmental disabilities at the top. So when we think about working and being inclusive of people with disabilities, it's wise to look at the prevalence rates in the population of the kinds of activities your program or activity is going to serve. Now we get into a little bit of history. The 1980s were you can call it the history of proclamations about people with disabilities. The UN established a UN decade for persons with disabilities from 1983, I think, to 1992. In the 90s, we began to see donors, particularly USAID in 1997, establish policies on disability. These were mostly not mandatory or binding, but guidelines or aspirational policies to be inclusive and be mindful of being inclusive in our programming. In the 80s, we also saw, in the 90s, set-asides, earmarks for programs for people with disabilities. In the US Congress started in, I think it was 1989, the Leahy War Victims Fund, and subsequently established a wheelchair fund, a child blindness program, a program in Vietnam that addresses disability caused by Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, and then a disability program, which I think Kathy will talk more about later, which provides USAID some flexibility in programming that I think has some real interesting opportunities to it. The 2000s, we began to see more donor agencies establish disability specialist, disability coordinator positions. We saw that at the World Bank, at USAID, at other donors, UNICEF. Later on, we see that now at GPE and the Inter-American Development Bank. And then now in the 2010s, even in, IFAS was probably the first to establish a disability position, but we see implementing partners, and groups like Save the Children and World Vision have dedicated staff focusing on disability. And finally, in the 2010s and now 20s, we're beginning to see disability program moving from the margins of international development more over recent years closer towards, not quite in the center of international development programming. One of the big game changers in this progression was the 2018 Summit on Disability and Development hosted by the United Kingdom's Department for International Development. And that was because the impetus came from the leadership, from the very top of DFID. And that attracted the attention of the leadership of multiple donor agencies, particularly groups like the World Bank made 10 commitments at the DFID Summit, including one that said every one of our education projects will be disability inclusive by 2025. We're still not sure what that means, but it's something worth noting and worth tracking. The other actors in this are the disabled persons organizations. Their global offices have been very active in advocacy around international development. And with them, through a structure called GladNet, there are regular meetings between the donor community and the DPOs around these issues. That has helped some in moving these issues more towards the center of development, but they still are largely, we largely see pilot projects and waiting to see how those come to scale. And that really is where we're going to start today. We're going to start with our panelists talking about what they're seeing and doing in terms of disability and development, and then we'll pivot to a discussion on what would it take to bring all of this to scale. And so with that, we'll start with Ruby. Introduce yourself for a few minutes, and then we'll get everyone introduced, and then we'll start our discussion.
Hi everyone, my name is Ruby Holmes. I'm an Inclusive Governance Technical Advisor at Humanity Inclusion, formerly known as Handicap International. I first want to thank the Society for International Development for organizing this and for welcoming HI to share our experiences. So within HI, I support our different field teams specifically around civil society engagement, specifically with DPOs, Organizations of Persons with Disabilities. We also work with ministries and service providers to ensure that policies are inclusive and services are inclusive for persons with disabilities. And we work in both development and humanitarian contexts. Typically, I work more in the development sector, but right now, as we'll discuss with COVID, we're all shifting more towards humanitarian. So I'll be trying to share a perspective around both of those as far as an implementing partner. I also work on civic engagement for our partners, and I also serve as a DPO task group co-coordinator within the International Disability and Development Consortium. I think that's a quick overview. And before I worked at HI, I worked for Mobility International USA. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Carolyn Aylesbury, Save the Children.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolyn Aylesbury. I'm a basic education advisor at Save the Children. I'm also one of our global focal points for inclusive education. I co-lead some internal working groups on inclusive education at Save the Children, as well as I have been the co-lead of the Education Equity Research Initiative's Disability Task Team, which I noticed some of you, some of our members are on the line, so hi to all of them. And I, in my role as a technical advisor, I support a variety of programs on the education side at Save the Children, looking at how we can make our education programs more inclusive, how we can engage more effectively with DPOs on the ground, and how we can really advocate for continuing to expand disability inclusion across all of Save the Children's programs, as education has been a bit further along relative to some other technical areas within not just Save the Children, but I know within large NGOs, implementing agencies, development partners in general. So it's nice to be here. Thank you, Sid, for inviting Save the Children, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great. Henna, Jahan, do you want to introduce yourself? Volume.
You're on mute.
Henna, you're on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
Hello? Hello?
Yes,
Is this
we can
okay?
hear you. Yes.
Okay. This is Jahan from Bangladesh. Okay. At present, I am doing a disability organization. Name is Alliance of Urban DPOs in Chittagong. Is a DPOs network in Chittagong, and I also president of Women with Disability Development Organization. And in this organization, we are working for women with disabilities and gender, education, and employment. As well as I'm a member of Disability Districts Committee in Chittagong as a member of DPO leader. I'm working with this organization since 2007 for establishing rights of persons with disabilities, as well as a member of DPO's leader. I'm advocating with the government and also private sector for the, especially I'm doing for job and education in our country, and as well as I'm capacity development leader and experience I have. I give capacity development for people with disabilities in Chittagong. And as well as now we are working inclusive education and inclusive employment for people with disabilities in Chittagong area. Yes, this is.
And Kathy Guernsey from USAID.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me to join today, and thank you for holding this session. So yes, I'm the agency disability coordinator. I wear, in a sense, two hats at USAID. One hat, Jerry alluded to, I'm responsible for one of the congressionally earmarked funds that relate to disability. I have other colleagues who manage the Wheelchair Fund, the Leahy War Victims Fund, and so forth. And the other hat that I wear is to try to encourage colleagues across the agency to be inclusive of persons with disabilities in our development work. By background, I'm a public international lawyer by background. I used to apologize as a recovering lawyer, and when I worked for Judy Human, she used to tell me, no, stop doing that, you haven't recovered at all. But I really got my start in disability work with the negotiations for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It wasn't a field that I intended to go into, but having started in that field, I discovered it was a wonderful area to work in. And I've been very fortunate to spend the last 20 years or so working in international disability development, diplomacy, and human rights. So.
So now we'll begin the discussion in earnest. We want to begin sort of as each of our panelists sees the starting point. Where are we now in your work, what you're seeing in the sector you work in, and what advances have you seen over the last few years in the incorporation or addressing disability in the context of your organization's work and what you're seeing more broadly. So we'll start with where we began with Ruby. If you want to just take a few minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, to talk about HI's work and what you're seeing and have seen over the last few years.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's been exciting to have been working in the disability sphere for almost a decade, that there's been a lot of momentum and a lot of interest around disability inclusion, and really kind of more mainstream organizations really seeing the importance of including the largest minority group in the world across their programs. So we're seeing a lot more focus from donors. Jerry, you mentioned the Global Disability Summit led by DFID. That built a lot of momentum. A lot of other donors are starting to require disability inclusion within their programming. So, seeing that kind of top level interest is really making a difference as far as implementing partners. So HI, having been a disability specific organization, we're starting to partner more with mainstream organizations and kind of taking a holistic approach to help them be more inclusive, both within their own organization as far as hiring persons with disabilities, their policies internally, but then also their program design. We're also seeing a lot more policy development around disability inclusion. Kathy mentioned the CRPD, which has been instrumental because it is legally binding, but also different frameworks like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. 7 of the SDGs specifically mention disabilities, and the entire Agenda 2030 is leave no one behind. So we've been really able to take the CRPD and match it with the SDGs, and how do you implement the SDGs so that they are fully inclusive. So we've done a lot of trainings on how do you match the SDGs with the CRPD, and there's been more funding around the SDGs as well. Also, just the overall switch from the medical approach to disability to the more rights-based approach. So not doing programming for people with disabilities, but with people with disabilities, and really a focus around meaningful participation of DPOs and their members within program design, implementation. So I think having that participation is absolutely crucial, and getting the support of donors and other organizations around that participation has been really exciting to see. Also around disability data, there's tend to be a very big lack in disaggregated data around disability, gender, and age. So seeing the Washington group questions and different tools to be able to really have evidence on the situation of persons with disabilities around the world. And the last comment I'll make is around climate change and protracted conflicts. Because those are on the rise around the world, we are seeing a lot more humanitarian responses and actors focused on including people with disabilities within their response. So it's been, for at least within HI, there's been a lot more momentum within mainstream organizations, the UN with their disability strategy, funding. So hoping that the momentum keeps going.
Great, thanks, Ruby.
Thank you.
You work for a large international NGO that focuses on children, working in probably over 100 countries, I would guess. What does inclusion look like at Save the Children? What are you seeing?
Thanks, Jerry. I would second, first of all, almost everything that Ruby just said from the perspective of a large NGO that does not have disability inclusion as the main focus of the organization, but has been mainstreaming it throughout programming. Absolutely, there has been so much momentum in the past few years. I've been with Save the Children for 10 years. And now when I first started, disability inclusion was seen almost like a niche area that, I mean, operated as if it were an option, that you know, we could have programs that were disability inclusion or not. I mean, functionally, that's how it worked. And the whole approach and perspective to disability inclusion has shifted. It's done a complete 180, I would say, in the past 10 years, where it's now seen as a real core component of programming, that there's much more recognition and understanding across the organization that disability inclusion is you know, a necessary component of what we are doing, which is working for children and operationalizing the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We talk much more about the CRPD now in our work as well. Previously, I would say that we had you know, a laser focus on the Convention on the Rights of the Child only, which you know, obviously does have some articles about, or has an article about disability inclusion in there as well. But you know, just having these other rights instruments and tools out there that people are talking about more, that people are much more aware of, has made a huge difference. I would say you know, Ruby mentioned the focus from donors. That has been very instrumental in shifting mainstream organizations to focus more on disability inclusion. And I know DFID and I believe NORAD as well have made the Washington Group tools component. I believe it's mandatory component of all of their programming, because now we see that across our whole organization, there are so many more offices that are asking for information on the Washington Group tool. They're asking for information on what to do when they're gathering this data, and how can they make sure that their programs are effectively then responding to the data that they collect, which has been very, very, very helpful. Which I should also say, that's not to say that we have solved all of those problems, and that data and data disaggregation and screening instruments are all going swimmingly without problems. There are certainly a lot of gaps and issues that we still need to address, which I know we will talk about later. But honestly, just having these conversations more has been so much more impactful than you know, the position that we were in years ago, which was having these small niche programs that were trying to share and showcase what they were doing within the organization. And you know, without that additional overall enabling environment and atmosphere of mainstreaming disability inclusion just within the industry in general, it's yeah, I would just say that that's made a really big difference. And then I would just say that related to that, the networking and the collaboration and the experience sharing across organizations has really increased quite a bit lately. I mean, I know this is this is the third external event that I've been on in the last 2 weeks for disability inclusion, and that's amazing. And I see a lot of familiar faces, people, you know, we interact with each other in different, on different platforms, different coalitions, different settings. We're sharing what we know. We're, you know, really trying to increase the global capacity in this area together, which has been really, really, really amazing to see. And that includes everything from, you know, implementation to, Ruby mentioned data, which was the focus of the disability task team under the Education Equity Research Initiative that we were, you know, had a mission to address over the past 3 years. There's also a lot of advocacy work going on, much more that has brought in a lot more of the mainstream actors. So yeah, I really agree with the you know, the momentum that we were talking about. I think that's only continuing to scale up, and I think it's really going to continue to change the way international development, at least from the perspective of a large NGO, you know, just indefinitely. I think it's really going to continue to get better from here.
I just want to add a couple of things. You talked about the Washington statistics, and I want to mention that UNICEF and their multi-indicator cluster surveys, household surveys, in every country where UNICEF works, are ramping up their use of the Washington statistics to get much more nuanced data about children with disabilities in the household, and that will include much more detail about out-of-school children, which can really help to drive donor decision-making and country decision-making. I also want to highlight, I know Josh Josai is on the call, a tool that USAID developed about 1.5 years ago. It's the guidance note on disability inclusive education. And this is important because it's one, it's a very good tool, and two, it can really help guide the way implementing partners respond to proposals in the education sector that call for a project to address the education of children with disabilities. And then the World Bank is also developing a policy guidance, has developed a policy guidance for its team in education on disability and inclusive education. So yeah, there's a lot of specific things going on that can really inform decision-making in project and program design. I do want to say, before we get to Janan and Kathy, the conversation has shifted. I've been told by people at the bank, for instance, that 3 years ago, they would hear, why are we talking about this? And now what you hear at the bank is, how do we do this? And and finally, when I've been at this a little longer than some of you. When I first started at IFAS, I remember one of my colleagues looked at me and said, well, what are you doing here? So I think we've come a long way. So Janan, I'll turn it to you from the DPO's perspective. If you could share, again, in a few minutes, what you're seeing and what you're doing.
Me?
Yes, please.
Okay. And I'd like to thank Ruby and all of you again because of today I can share my experience also about disability field in Bangladesh and globally. Okay. So education, first I would like to say education sector in Bangladesh and overall the world, what is going in Bangladesh, and also DPO's movement. Okay. DPO, Disabled People Organization, actually involved in the inclusive education or in since 19 maybe. They are working in this field for rights of persons with disability establishment. But people with disability actually excluded still now in Bangladesh and over the world, I think, because of still people with disability are behind. Our Millennium Development Goal, SDG, everywhere is mentioned is people with disability have to include, but still in Bangladesh, people with disability are excluded. If I say in Corona, COVID-19, people with disabilities, what's happened in the world, in Bangladesh? You know, Bangladesh is now COVID. Bangladesh government taken some, attending some activities for people with disabilities, but it's not active activation because of COVID-19. It's a very dangerous. But what's happened with the people with disabilities? Who are very affected the COVID-19, but we cannot do anything. We cannot think. If one person, if people with disabilities who are physically disabled, who are mentally disabled, if they affected, then whole family will be affected by that, because of they need a lot of supported. But I think in globally and Bangladesh also no any no any what I said activation active rules about the women people with disabilities in area. In hospital, no way. In education sector, still no way. In Bangladesh, education sector little bit going fast. Which is a new instruction, new building. They have a little bit accessibility going on, but most of the building, most of the students still behind due to lack of accessibility. Okay.
Jinan, let me ask you a question. Could you talk about how the DPOs you're affiliated with
yes, DPO,
are involved, not in COVID-19, but in some of the mainstream development activities that are funded by DFID or USAID? If you just taking us, we'll get to COVID-19 in the second half of the program.
Okay.
Really are interested in what's the role of the DPO in mainstream international development activities.
DPO role, actually mainstream DPO is working for people with disabilities to become development sector. In every verb, people with disability have to attend their all development sector, but people with disability cannot attend. I want to say that because of lack of accessibility still in all over the world. In Bangladesh perspective, if I say, people, disabled people want to do more work with the development sector, but if I say in Bangladesh, disability organization, a lot of lackings, because of in Bangladesh, people has no, wait. Okay.
Is everything all right, Jinan?
Okay, yes, I'm going on. Okay. So in development sector, DPO movement is going fast, but sometimes disability organization cannot do more work due to, information, due to fund of source, due to, accessibility. That's why I want to say disabled people organization now is doing good activities in Bangladesh. Okay, so. Hello, is it okay?
Let's, mindful of the time, I want to, if we can, go to Kathy Guernsey from USAID to hear where you think things are from a donor perspective or from your perch at USAID. Thank you, Kathy.
Hi, I think I've unmuted myself correctly. My laptop is having a minor meltdown at the moment, so hopefully this is working. I absolutely align myself with the comments that have been made thus far. I think I had reason recently to be thinking of this as we were looking at the recent GLAD network meeting that was held in Washington, D.C., the first time the United States had hosted the GLAD network. And thinking back on how things have changed in the last 20 years. Absolutely, the kinds of things that have been mentioned thus far, I think, are really important. And I want to, the comments that were made about the CRPD and the SDGs, I think there are a couple of aspects of those beyond just what the documents say that are important. And I think specifically how those documents were negotiated has been a real game changer. What they look like, those documents, is clearly very important. To have those explicit references, to have the sort of badge of being an official issue within the UN human rights architecture, those are all important things. But I think how they were negotiated was equally important, because it placed people with disabilities at the table as equal partners with governments. The first draft of the CRPD, the working group that negotiated it, that was the first time in a UN treaty context that a group of governments and non-governmental organizations came together with equal rights of participation. And I think it really changed how the disability community was perceived. Now, to Jahan's point, I think we still have a disparity between the sort of top level, grass tops level, and then the grassroots level. We don't yet have sufficient engagement from the grassroots level. And I think that's something that we all in the donor community are struggling with. There's always that tension between wanting to do large scale projects because from an overhead perspective, that's the most efficient thing to do, but recognizing that those projects, the nature of them can be very challenging for the on the ground groups who have that local knowledge, that local contacts, that local expertise, finding a good interface to ensure that we're bringing them in. And that's something that we're continuing to do. I want to give a shout out to organizations like Abilis and the Disability Rights Fund for their work to build the capacity of those DPOs. And I also, to the point that was made about the intentionality of donors, clearly that has changed. I've been very pleased. I've been at USAID now for almost 1 year. I'll reach my 1 year anniversary at the end of this month. But since I've been at USAID, today unfortunately is Administrator Green's last day, but I've been very pleased to see the kind of high level leadership from Administrator Green in his public comments when he talks about inclusive development. Persons with disabilities are included. He gave opening remarks to the GLAD network, and he specifically acknowledged that this is something that we're striving to do across our portfolios and recognizing that we need to do more. We've seen similar things with DFID and hosting the global summit. So I do appreciate very much that high level leadership, particularly when one works in a bureaucracy. It's really helpful. You need that North Star for colleagues in a bureaucracy to appreciate that, yes, this is something that we all need to be attentive to. And I also, particularly as I have some colleagues from USAID here, Josh and Leah, I want to give a shout out to those colleagues at USAID who in their operating units have really looked to be intentional in terms of their own inclusion. E3 education colleagues are really taking ownership of this issue as something that the Education Bureau should be doing as just part of what they do. And I think that's terrific. We've seen similar things from the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. They have policies related to disability. So I think it's been really great to see that. Obviously, we want to see more of that, right? That needs to be agency-wide. We need to get to the point where the inclusion is not a remarkable feature of what we do. It's just part and parcel of what we automatically do. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
We want to get to questions in a minute, but I want to ask each of you the same question. If there's one thing, what's one thing that could happen that would bring disability in development to scale? Ruby, do you want to go first? And this is a lightning round, just one quick idea, really be a game changer.
Well, so while we're seeing a lot of attention from donors, I think that there still needs to be a focus on the time and the funding that is required for quality inclusion, and really looking at further marginalized groups, so populations who are deafblind or psychosocial disabilities. So not just checking off inclusion as one of something you've done, but really investing the amount of time and resources that are needed.
Carolyn.
It is really hard to pick just one, but I would say somewhat similarly, I think the prioritization of having a very, very, very high beneficiary count in large projects is a bit at odds with trying to make sure that that project is really, really inclusive. And what we see often is that getting that high beneficiary count can actually reduce the amount of support and the focus that can actually be spent on really intensive inclusive activities. So it's a metric type comment.
Okay. Can I a quick comment on what
Do you say again, please? I can't hear you because of network problem. A question again.
Sure. What's one thing that would really help bring these issues to scale, to expand activities around disability and development? What needs to change in what you're seeing?
Actually, if you want to change in the disability sector, you have to improve the disability people, disabled organization skilled, okay, and have to be give opportunity to them. Otherwise, you cannot improve disabled people living standard. You cannot do anything. They are changed. You have to work donor. They have to flexible, and they have to more easy for work to just like a bridge, but no any compliment. Heard any link. Just soft and free. Then people with disability, people with disabled organization will be go first, and they can do work development sector. If you make barrier, lot of activities you want to do, they cannot.
Thank you. Kathy.
Yeah, I build on the comment that was made about making sure it's quality inclusion. I think we need to do a better job of learning from what we're doing and sharing that knowledge. And a salient example of that, I want to give a shout out to our E3 education colleagues for the multi-country study on inclusive education that we're undertaking. And I'm very happy that our fund was able to contribute in a small way to that. But I think those kinds of studies are really important so that we understand what is working, why is it working, what are the contexts in which it is working, and then how do we learn from that so that we can either replicate, change, adapt, build on, so that we're not just doing a project and saying, isn't it great, we did something that was inclusive, but how do we learn from that? And if we've made mistakes, if there are things that did not work, we need to be really open about that and share that more broadly so that we make new mistakes, but we don't repeat mistakes that others have made.
And I would just add a word you mentioned earlier, intentionality. We really need to be purposeful about disability inclusion. And I see a comment from Simmons-Benton that it needs to be cross-cutting, and I would agree with that. And Denise, do you want to help navigate the Q&A part of this?
Oh, Jerry, I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Okay, so you already mentioned Anne's question, so I'll skip over that. So I'll go to Denise Bear, who in her question, I'll repost it in the chat because I see we have a few more questions that have come up. So it's the question is, for program development, what tools are available for working with folks who are differently abled? When we do gender programs, we're often asked to include disabled, but differential ability challenges require different adaptations for programming, e.g. hearing, sight, physical, and there are differences if there are disabilities are from birth, disease, or trauma. What tools are available for specific disability responsive programming?
Anyone want to answer that? Ruby, Carolyn?
Go ahead, Ruby.
Sure. So one thing I think is important is looking at all different disability types. So, and also mainstreaming disability into programming. So not doing disability specific programming. I feel like that was used to be an approach, but now making sure that persons with all different disability types are being included in all programming and mainstreaming. So as far as, I mean, there's a lot of different resources out there as far as inclusion, and how do you take the twin track approach of, you know, supporting the person with the disability themselves, but then also changing the systems and the environment around them. I know, speaking on behalf of HI, we have multiple publications and resources that I can share, but that's a few quick ideas.
Yeah, I will just add that on the education side, there are a lot of different resources that are out there, including two great resources that USAID released in the past few years, the How-To Note on Disability Inclusion, which Josh Josa authored, he's on the call, and then the very long titled Universal Design for Learning. Jerry, help me out. It's about reading, inclusive education, and literacy programs. Right, yeah, Universal Design for Learning, plus a second part of that title. And then UNESCO also has some nice resources. They developed the, thank you, Josh, for putting the toolkit in the chat box. UNESCO has quite a few resources, and then we are seeing a lot of resources coming out from individual organizations as well. Again, I'm speaking pretty much just on the side of education. Save the Children has some resources. I know HI has resources. I've seen things from CRS, from Plan. So the resources are out there. I think what a bigger gap right now seems to be getting the resources to the people who need them, and then getting that commitment from the people who need to use them. And you know, it's been said several times now that having that leadership position of someone who's really committed at the high levels of an organization or of an agency really makes the difference. And I mean, I can attest to that as well from Save the Children, just seeing how much things shifted once we had someone at a very high level who was more committed to disability inclusion. So yeah, I think we just need to make all those connections between all of them.
I think it's important. I want to go back to Ann Simmons-Benton's note about cross-cutting. A lot of our references are in the education sector, frankly, because that's where a lot of the action has been. And I think we need to, from an advocacy point of view, look at the health investments, look at democracy and governance and other sectors of funding, and really call for a greater attention and intentionality around disability inclusion. Paul, I will go back to you.
Great. So next question is from Large JWDC. How are we ensuring that people with disabilities are leading us in this work? That's for the panel generally.
And it's how are we ensuring that people with disabilities are included in this work?
Leading us in this work is
leading us in this work. Kathy talked a bit about that challenge from a donor perspective. Maybe Kathy, you want to, because you've had multiple perspectives on this very question throughout your career.
So I can certainly talk from the perspective where I am now, the funds for which I'm responsible for. That funding, we allow USAID missions to compete for the funding. And we're very clear in advertising that opportunity to USAID missions that the intention of these funds is for them to build the capacity of DPOs, and that the project concept ideas really need to be coming from the disability community. We recognize the challenge that I referenced earlier, that sometimes the administrative management of a USAID project is more than many DPOs are in a position to handle. And so we certainly encourage partnerships between organizations that may have that administrative capacity and DPOs, so the DPOs bring their technical expertise and the other organizations can bring some of their management expertise, preferably with a view to building the capacity of the DPO as the project continues. And we're also very clear that where a non-DPO is the prime organization, we need to have affirmative evidence that the disability community is supportive of the approach being taken. It's not enough for applicants to give lip service to these issues. It's not enough for them to just say, oh, we're going to include people. We need to really concretely see how that's being done. We need to see that there is a disability community perspective that has been brought into the project in a collaborative way. And we need explicit communications of support from the disability community, so we know that the project concept is reflective of their preferences and their approaches. I did want to say just briefly to the last question, if I may add, I think I got the impression that one of the issues that was being raised was the issue of reasonable accommodation. And I know Mobility International USA has done a lot from the context of international exchanges about how to get groups to be thinking about access and inclusion up front. And I would just caution, I think sometimes, particularly for folks who are new to this, there's a tendency to want a guide that tells you everything up front about how to include somebody with insert name of disability here. And I would just caution colleagues that true reasonable accommodation is a process, and it's a very individualized process. You could have two people with the exact same disability with very different reasonable accommodation needs. So I think, again, this is an area where direct collaboration and direct communication with the community is key, so that we're making sure we get that kind of quality that Carolyn spoke of. And there are many great tools out there that can help in starting that conversation. Really be a dialogue, not just a sort of checkbox exercise.
Great, and please mute yourself if you're not speaking. That might help on the sound quality. I wanted to add something around into what intentionality might look like. Within the USAID world, it might look like our proposals that we submit are evaluated, that disability inclusion has weight in the evaluation criteria for proposals that are submitted. Because without that, it's not discussed by the technical review committee that is examining proposals from multiple organizations. The other way we can change is by looking at the metrics we use to determine whether our projects are successful, and seeing if those metrics are enhancing inclusion because the metrics we use on whether or not an activity is performing well incentivizes certain practices and disincentivizes certain practices. So that our metrics need to be looked at through a disability lens. And Paul, I'm mindful we want to pivot to COVID-19, so maybe we have time for one or two more questions. I know there's some good ones up on the chat box.
Yes, yeah, I was going to mention that we have six more questions that just came up, so I'll I guess we could save those closer to for the end. Excuse me, from Elise Young. So this is specifically for Kathy. I really agree with Jahan's great comment that we need to support more partnerships with DPOs, invest in them, learn from them, and support their capacity building. What can USAID and other donors do to require more substantial partnerships with DPOs and greater investment?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly where I sit at USAID, the nature of my funding is such that that's our large focus, right? The real challenge is to ensure that our colleagues across the agency are taking a similar approach when they are doing projects that are not necessarily disability focused, but need to be inclusive of persons with disabilities. I recognize this is probably a good entree point for me to acknowledge that whilst USAID was one of the first bilateral donors to adopt a policy on inclusion of persons with disabilities in our development work, that policy still stands from 1997. And so, although I think the core components of it, do not discriminate, do be inclusive, I don't foresee those two core components changing. I do want to acknowledge that we are in the early phases of a revision process for that policy. So I see Josh smiling. unfortunately, this was actually one of the core times when I was going to be starting to get the working group together, and then the COVID-19 crisis hit. But that is something that we have a high-level support for within the agency, that we need to refresh that policy, bring it up to speed, to make sure that it is consistent with and relevant to a very different universe that exists now than existed in 1997. We have a completely different international framework, and many more opportunities that we can build upon now, and more experience at the agency. So I foresee the process of developing that new policy, as well as the end document. I see those as great opportunities for really building out this approach to disability inclusion across the work of USAID.
Paul, are we ready to pivot?
Well,
If there's a burning question, let's hear it.
okay, no, it's not burning. We can save them for the end.
Okay. So as we said at the onset, at the beginning of this, we're going to spend the last 15, 20 minutes or so talking about how the donor community and all of our organizations are pivoting to adapt to the world of COVID-19, and how do we maintain this focus we've been talking about around disability equity and inclusion. This, I believe, is the greatest, COVID-19 response is the greatest challenge to development assistance in developing nations and the world that I think we've seen in our lifetimes. This is not an Ebola crisis in Liberia where other countries can help. This is every country going through crisis, which has stress, and you can see it in your own organizations. It stresses our organizations, our lives, our staff, and ourselves. And from my discussions with folks in the community and the donor world, there's a fear of backsliding, that we'll adopt a triage mentality of providing services to people, and the most vulnerable will be left aside. And I'll give you 2 data points, if you will. The WHO and CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, both have guidances on their websites for assisted living facilities in the world of COVID-19. Those guidances don't mention facilities where people with children and adults with disabilities reside, whether it's an orphanage, a so-called orphanage, psychiatric institution, or special schools for children with disabilities. These will be breeding grounds for the spread of the virus, and that issue needs to be addressed. UNICEF has a guidance on education in COVID-19 it's also on WHO's website that doesn't mention, it mentions children with disabilities, but doesn't mention residential schools. People with disabilities have largely, in many cases, been invisible historically to the development assistance community. That has changed, as our discussion over the last hour reveals. So what are we doing to work towards a response to COVID-19 that is inclusive? I know donors, and we'll start with Kathy, have set up task agencies, task forces across their programs within each sector to talk about this. So maybe we can talk about how do we become how do disability DPOs and disability organizations and experts become part of that process as we look not just for inclusion, but as we look to solutions. Kathy, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, I don't think it is an overstatement to say that this is one of the greatest challenges on any fronts that any of us have encountered in our careers. USAID and the State Department were required to put together, in one of the congressional stimulus packages, the legislation requires us to put together a joint strategy, and that joint strategy has been submitted to Congress. I was trying to find a public version of it to share, but I'm afraid I've been unsuccessful so far. But I can say that persons with disabilities are explicitly referenced in that strategy as one of the many, especially at-risk and marginalized populations that need to be included. You alluded to the existence of a task force. We have an agency-wide task force that is dual-hatted. It works on not only our staff and just the management of the organization in a time of crisis, but also the policy perspective. What are we doing in terms of our response? And many bureaus have set up their own task teams so that we can feed into that process. For those of us who do not sit in a bureau that specifically does humanitarian work, one of the things that we're trying to do is to be a conduit for the disability community so that we can feed information into those processes as best that we can. We're also endeavoring to work collaboratively with other colleagues. For example, our colleagues who work on children in adversity, very good at being inclusive of children with disabilities, working with colleagues in E3 education as we pivot to a learning environment where people are not physically in school, and really trying to draw from good practice and experience wherever we find it. I've been very gratified to see that a number of our implementing partners have been able to make a pivot to be able to continue doing what they do in their programming, but they are frequently partners who are in environments where there is a good internet and fairly pervasive use of technology. That is not the case in many countries. And I think the other thing I would just put out here is I think we need to also recognize, you mentioned this is a stressful time for all countries, regardless of resource level. And we're seeing some pretty disturbing practices referenced, and the disability community, International Disability Alliance has been doing a great job with their Monday Facebook Live events to draw attention to the concerns. You mentioned triage, concerns around do not resuscitate orders, blanket orders based on disability category, complete lack of communications access for people. And I think we need to recognize that some of the interventions that we're looking at here may not have any explicit reference to persons with disabilities, but will greatly benefit persons with disabilities. For example, availability of protective equipment is one of the avenues through which we can ensure communication access for people who need an interpreter. We're seeing here in the United States, interpreters not allowed in hospitals because there's no way of protecting them. We don't have enough equipment. So those larger health system strengthening interventions are one of the pivot points to make sure that we can facilitate communication, access, inclusion, information sharing. We all need to do a better job of making sure that emergency information sharing is accessible and inclusive of persons with disabilities. So again, we need to be a conduit. We need to have, this is where having good relationships before a crisis is critical, because we can draw on those relationships during the crisis to feed information into those people who are making those decisions. And with that, I'm going to pause because I know.
Okay, Kathy, we lost your sound, but there you go. Carolyn, do you want to go next? I see your mic is on.
Sure, that's because I have it muted on my system instead. So with I second everything that Kathy just said. It is definitely the crisis of our time, and it's we're taking a situation. So I'm speaking again on from the perspective of education. We're taking a situation, when we looked at the barriers to inclusive education before, we're taking all of those barriers and adding them on top of all of the new barriers or expanded barriers of an education and emergencies response. And what that actually looks like in some places is completely catastrophic. I mean, it's catastrophic everywhere, but as Kathy mentioned, we do have some places where there is a really strong internet connection. There's, the Ministry of Education has been able to pivot more or less towards an online curriculum, which certainly still has many, many barriers for inclusion, but we're still starting from a place that's somewhat workable. I support a project in Western Tanzania. It's in a refugee camp already. So this is now a very complex emergency where it was a refugee camp and now there's the COVID crisis. And in that refugee camp, people are not allowed to have radios. They're not allowed to have, there's no cell phone signal, and no one is allowed to meet in groups. So now we're trying to figure out how can we do anything that is inclusive in a context where you can't meet with people face to face and you can't transmit any sort of messages. And that's, I mean, it's really, really difficult. And some of these barriers are just, I mean, I would not have been able to imagine, I know none of us really would have, even 3 months ago, what we would be dealing with now. So it does feel like a bit of a setback in many situations. That being said, I will say there's still obviously a lot of attention and interest and focus on trying to be as inclusive as we possibly can while we're trying to continue some degree of learning for children, or helping children to mitigate any amount of learning loss that would be experienced from this crisis. So I will say that at Save the Children, we also have working groups and a whole response structure that is kicked into place. And on the education side, the resource development and guidance that is coming out all has been channeled through the inclusive education team. So all of the materials that are being developed for education COVID response at Save the Children all have a component of that, an inclusive lens being applied to it, which, you know, it's certainly better than what I would have expected if this had happened 5 years ago. It definitely reassures me that people are having the right conversations, but then I think the biggest challenge is when we get to, you know, on the ground, the barriers that we're coming up against, particularly in really the most remote and difficult implementation contexts like that example I gave from Tanzania. There's a lot more work to be done to figure out what we can do and how can it be quality inclusion, because yeah, it's unlike any situation I have ever implemented in before. So.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. I think we're all grasping right now, and I think the conversation is critical to have with the donor community as we assess what's going on the ground in each country and figure out what we can do to operationalize something. I think that's going to be an ongoing discussion that we hope DPOs and disability organizations are part of. Janan, let's go to you and see if you could share with us, in the COVID-19 world we're now in, what conversations, if any, are you having with the Bangladeshi government as it pivots to a response, or with international organizations that might be working in your country?
Hello, কথাটা বুঝতেছি না. I can't hear.
Okay, can you hear
I can't
this?
hear you properly. I can't hear you properly.
Okay. Paul, maybe you want to write a note to Janan, or she is a reader, I think, with her, that we can get the question to her in a different format.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing.
And then Ruby, let's then go to you and see what HI is thinking or doing in this new world.
Okay, yeah, I'll fill in until Jahan is able to share, because I think her experience is the most important. But we are, as far as HI is concerned, we are working in 52 countries, having to really adapt or stop our activities. Bangladesh is one of them. I know we're working with our team there to support DPOs to get kind of a risk and needs assessment to different households to really learn about the experience that persons with disabilities are experiencing, and use that information to share with you know, the government, local authorities, but also with donors. We've been really appreciative that most of our donors have been very flexible as far as funds, and either, you know, letting us adapt our projects so that they are COVID specific, or we're even seeing new proposals coming out for funding specifically for COVID. But especially around, you know, keeping costs going to structural costs so that our staff are still able to be paid. Because like everyone said, this is nothing that we've experienced before. While we are, you know, we do a lot of humanitarian work, we've never had, you know, globally this in all of our countries. So we're also really urging organizations to follow the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities into humanitarian contexts. Widely, we're seeing stigma and discrimination as persons with disabilities are trying to access healthcare. That's even if they're getting the communication. I know Kathy said that, you know, we really need to make sure that the information that's being shared is accessible in all formats for all disability types. But when they are able to access healthcare, it's not inclusive, or they're not, because of discrimination and prioritization of care, they're not receiving care. We're also really focused on the isolation. I know it's difficult for all of us, but we're seeing gender-based violence is increasing across the world. Women with disabilities experience this at a higher rate as it is, but now that they're in isolation, we're also seeing that with children with disabilities who aren't able to go to school. But there's also a lack of access to caregivers or personal assistants and essential medications. So really looking at the dangers that's coming from isolation for persons with disabilities in all settings. One more quick thing I'll say is what we're doing in Iraq is we created tools to monitor the CRPD at community level, looking at health, livelihood, and education. So right now we're adapting those to respond to COVID, and working with the umbrella organization, but also working in areas where there aren't DPOs or self-help groups to try to gather that information. But I'd love to see if, Jahan, can you hear us yet? I'd love to hear your experiences.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruby. Already you have a lot of experience shared. Are you hearing?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Actually, which is I want to share first that in health sector, already I told a little bit something, and the people with disability actually, you know, all over the world, and who are actually living like Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, they are actually isolated still now. You know, COVID-19, you know, Bangladesh government taken some action for people with disabilities to help, but it's not enough. You know, still today we done some work for people with disabilities who are in our area. 100 people with disabilities we are listed, who are more very vulnerable, who are very poor. Okay, they are now actually jobless within 15 days. Okay, they are already suffering a financial program and also I mean food crisis. So actually government and globally want to do something, but it's actually still now people with disabilities are behind. Disabled people organization in Bangladesh now is trying to do something for I mean people with disabilities, just food. Today we give some food who are our member. Okay, and in another area also some disabled organization want to do, but in hospital no access still now. In doctor, no, I mean no access in our area and whole Bangladesh actually. And some doctors said no, we cannot do anything for them. Okay, this is the experience in Bangladesh. Some people saying they have to clean it, etc., etc. But who has no hands? How they do cleaning? How do they care about themselves? How? Some people saying that. Okay, so last day we contact in our local television channel to taking some information or dissemination, but they cannot come actually because of Actually, they don't want to hear about our voice. Okay, this is the real situation in here. Actually, people with disabilities, I mean, organization is doing a little bit, but they have no capacity, actually, is the main fact. Capacity, they have energy, but financially, they are not, cannot. But I want to say in globally who are working now, if you organization want to do for people with disabilities inclusive, I mean important, or want to come a front line, you have to have flexible for them, otherwise they cannot do. Okay. So in education sector and health sector, same actually. In my another observation is, I mean, in donor or who are government or who are non-government sector, they want to work with disabled people organization, but most of the people want to volunteer actually. So here people said that how many days, how long we want to do volunteer actually. We need support, we want to need food. But most of the people, most of the organization want to say, you do, you can, you have to do. You have your people with disability organization, you have to work. But how we want to do? Okay, we need support. Then we can run. Then we can do. It's my experience actually in my field. So I request all of donors, if you guys want to include all of disabled people organization, you have to flexible, you have to give opportunity to disabled people organization. Okay, then we can do work, and you have to 100 to 100 I mean achievement. Otherwise we are always behind and also behind.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. One thought I had about, as you know, a lot of USAID's projects are going to have to pivot to their resources to address COVID-19. And one way to make sure they're inclusive is that they bring on board in those projects the local DPOs. Because the DPOs know where people with disabilities are, how they live, how they interact with the economy, with healthcare systems, with education systems, all of which are going to be stressed during this time. And so, and also the DPO community is going to be stressed as well because its resources are going to be diverted to other groups. So it would be good to be mindful of involving DPOs in the solution from the beginning as partners. I want to address a question that has been asked and then posted again a couple of times on the chat box, and it's from H. Booley, and it really asks like a comment I made early on that more and more you see international NGOs and USAID implementing partners hiring people to address this area of disability inclusion. And really the question is whether or not the people being hired are themselves people with disabilities. I think it's a very valid and important question. And I think the answer is not enough. We need to do a better job of, again, intentionally hiring people with disabilities, not just for those positions, but we need to hire people with disabilities who are agricultural specialists and engineers and teachers and political scientists and people who can contribute to the work in all of our sectors, not just from the disability perspective. When I was a managing director at the AIR, one of the people I hired was a woman with a hearing impairment who was an M&E specialist. And she brought to that role a different perspective that the M&E, the monitoring and evaluation team, did not have. That was important. It was also important for the organization to learn from one of its staff about what diversity and inclusion really meant. So yeah, I would say that, you know, we could have this discussion with the HR, and I wanted to have this discussion with the SID HR, the HR specialists from the SID members. Of how do we increase employment opportunities for people with disabilities throughout our organizations? And with that, I think we are almost out of time, 3 minutes left according to my clock, and I'm going to thank everyone for contributing, thanking the panelists and Denise and Katie and Sid Washington. I hope this was a benefit to the 50 some odd participants. I certainly learned from it and really appreciated the perspectives offered through the panelists and through the questions. I'll turn it back to Paul or Denise or Katie for final thoughts.
Yes, so thanks, Jerry, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your support and attendance, and I should say participation during this time. We really appreciate it and hope that you were able to get a lot out of this event today. It's a really important topic, and I'm glad we were able to still host this event. So again, thank you all the speakers. Thank Katie and Denise, our great co-chairs, for putting this event together, and also our ASL interpreters via Save the Children. Thank you for helping us out today. One last thing I'll mention before we wrap up is we just have a short survey. My intern Alice is posting it in the chat now. If we really would appreciate your feedback, it really helps us make our events even better than, and also as we, kind of navigate this time with, looking at virtual events and doing them on a much more frequent basis. So if you have some time to fill it out, we would really appreciate your feedback. And we'll leave the meeting room open a little bit longer in case you need to access the, so thank you for your time.
Can I ask you a quick question? Paul?
Yeah, Denise.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask, I know this has been recorded, right? And so it will be made available. I thought maybe, there's been a lot of great resources posted in the chat. So I was thinking perhaps we could just list that when we post the event recording, and would that be possible?
In the recording, the chat, all public chat messages should show up on the right hand side.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Stay safe and healthy and sane.
Okay, goodbye.
Great. Thank you, Jahan.